Nice gentle curve. They go round it like the edge of a 50p piece. So it's a straight line, pull on the lever, change the angle of the vehicle, another straight line, another pull on the lever. Now, proper tank at last, I hear you say. Right, this is what we recognise, isn't it, as a big armoured vehicle and a proper tank. This particular one coming on now, this is a tank that was made after World War II by the Americans, and it's called the M60, Model 60, 1960 it first went into production. And it's one of those tanks that dates back to that period we know of now, of the Cold War, when we thought the East was going to fight the Western nations. Now, all the NATO countries, that was really all the capitalist Western European countries in America. We knew in the West that we would never be able to make as many tanks as the Eastern Bloc countries, mainly led by Russia, were making. They had thousands and thousands of tanks. We knew we couldn't match them in terms of numbers, so we tended to go for quality and better technology on our vehicles, and that was reflected in this tank. This is, as you can see, it's a massive great lump of metal. This is the last generation of tank that was made out of steel. Modern tanks, you think they're made of metal. Actually, what quite often you're looking at is a skin on the outside of the vehicle, and under that skin there's very clever laminate armours. In other words, things made of different things together, sometimes ceramic, sometimes rubber, sometimes metal, all sandwiched together, and that can stop rounds better than the equivalent weight and thickness of steel. This is the last generation where you've got really big, just thick metal trying to stop the rounds that are being fired at it. In that turret on the top there, you've got a crew manning the gun there of 3. There's a 4th crew member who's a driver who's right down the front underneath the gun. In the turret, there's a commander, obviously in charge of everything, looking for where the enemy are, radioing down to the driver what's the best way forward. You're higher, you can see things sooner, and also picking out targets for the gunner. The gunner sits in front of him. He's the guy with the sights for that big 105mm gun, and he's the one who's telling him where to point and what's the most pressing target. In other words, what's the biggest threat that you need to take out first of all. On the other side of the turret is a loader. And if you ever have to pick a tank crew for yourselves, always pick your loader, someone who's short, stocky, built like a Russian shot putter, because the loader needs to be very fit and very strong, because he's picking up these massive, great 105mm rounds, putting them in the breech of the gun to fire them off. And the rate of fire of this tank will go down as the loader gets worn out. So you need someone who's really up to the job. Preferably nice and short as well, because you can imagine there's not an awful lot of room in that turret. Driver's down the front. He's almost lying on his back driving the tank, because the lower he is, the lower the gun can be, the lower the turret is, and then you're less of a profile. In other words, there's less for the enemy to see on that tank. Massive great diesel engine in the back, very thick armour, and the Americans actually made a lot of these tanks. Nowhere near the similar numbers of the Russian tanks, but they did make a fair old few. And again, they're still in service all around the world, and like I said earlier, lots of armoured vehicles, you can get upgrades for them. You buy all the super duper add-ons, new weapon systems, extra armour to put on the outside, new engines for the back, new transmissions to make it go faster. And that's a common thing that happens with lots of armoured vehicles nowadays. Now you can see it's got a jazzy camouflage scheme for the Middle East. The gun on this, I've said it's called it 105mm. We often see that figure, the different figures on front of the size of the guns. It's the size of the hole at the end of the barrel. So 10.5 centimetres across, 105mm. And this type of gun, when you were firing at another tank, you don't fire a bullet-shaped round like we used to coming out of pistols or rifles. If you're firing another tank at this generation, you actually fire a piston out the end of the barrel. The piston falls away, the sides of it fall away when it leaves the barrel, and it leaves about a 13-inch long metal dart flying towards the enemy tank at supersonic speeds, one of the fastest things on Earth. And that metal dart, at the back of it, it's got little fins on it, just like a dart you'd throw at a dartboard to keep it straight in flight. No explosive on it at all. It's made of dense metal like tungsten or depleted uranium, which is a waste product from the nuclear industry, and just the sheer kinetic energy, in other words, the sheer welly behind it, will smash its way through an enemy tank, quite often all the way through and out the other side. And it leaves one hell of a mess behind it. Very accurate gun as well. This gun, even though it's an American tank, was actually made by the British. We had it on our Centurion tanks. Tremendously accurate, very powerful, so the Americans put it on their tanks as well. Lots of countries still use it. So all in all, it was a very successful tank. It does see action around the world, but as we know, the Cold War, East versus West, never became a hot war. So a lot of these tanks, they did their job just by sitting out in Germany, making sure nothing ever kicked off. And fortunately, we're all here today, because frankly, if it had kicked off, probably we wouldn't be here today. Now, we're going to get the driver to drive the tank off now, and you can just hear how noisy a big battle tank like this is. So tank crews are taught to keep their tanks hidden from the enemy. They're bound to hear them coming, so you'll use the map to hide behind things and keep yourself away from being seen by the enemy to the last possible moment. And one of the other things you can see from that tank driving around, tanks have a psychological impact as well as their sheer firepower. If you can imagine you're an infantry soldier sitting in a trench somewhere, hearing that coming towards you, you've got to be a very stoic sort of fellow to let that come on. There is a